Our world is changing. We see economic changes, weather changes, social changes. People are asking, how can I be ready? Could I change my lifestyle if I needed to? Here on Rockbottom Survival Skills, our goal is to help you answer those questions.
We invite you to follow Rockbottom Survival Skills on our web pages, social media links, YouTube channels, podcast locations, and on-demand TV programs via Roku, smart TVs, and devices. Check the links below.
Welcome to Rockbottom Survival Skills. I'm John Elden Gibbons.
And I'm Teresa S. Landry.
On this episode of Rockbottom Survival Skills, we talk about living the dream. The good, the bad, and the ugly.
The very ugly. Views expressed on this podcast are our opinions and based on our personal experiences and are not meant to be professional or financial advice in any way, shape, or form.
Welcome to Rockbottom Survival Skills. I'm John Elden Gibbons.
And I'm Teresa S. Landry.
Join us as we continue our discussion on Rockbottom Survival Skills, Living the Dream, Episode 2.
You still hear cars going by. You hear airplanes.
We can hear the train in the distance.
The train in the distance,
which is really upsetting. But it's
how did if you're living in the middle of Montana, maybe Idaho. When I lived in Idaho, well, I was on an Air Force base at the time, but there was a 100-mile distance between where I was at and Boise. I'd love to go back because I got a feeling they probably filled a lot of that spot in now. Going northern Panhandle area, my parents and I used to travel there along the Snake River. That's a whole bunch of nothing, but it's a different terrain. It's unless you get up into way northern Idaho.
Yeah, it's really difficult to find any spots where you completely get
west,
away.
No, I disagree. Out west, it's still possible.
Nature.
And then being in Alaska, my travels in Alaska.
My experiences are mostly East Coast,
right,
and there's not a lot that's completely away from civilization.
You want to get off grid, you can get way off grid. Now,
not to live. You can get off grid on state land in New York.
Yeah, in New York, right? Yeah.
But up here, it's now. When I was in Virginia, there were places in the mountains that were really out there.
Yeah.
It was wonderful.
Well, the other thing is we're really close to Vermont, and on the Vermont side, I traveled a lot because I worked for a federal program where I was an admission counselor for a short period of time. Why was it short? Nothing wrong. It was a great program. I really enjoyed it. The problem always comes with the payoff. In other words, okay, I'm putting this amount of money into it. I'm traveling this distance. Is it worth it? And that's what we're doing here. We're living deliberately. We're saying, no, it's not. It's not worth it for me to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and go travel 200 miles a day.
It's also, from back to the exercise and nutrition point of view, which is my background, the sitting in the car for hours on end and out of sheer boredom, not even hunger, but boredom, you're eating crap food because that's what you get while you're sitting in your car. Carrot sticks just don't cut it when you're going to be sitting there for 3 hours. So I think there was a huge health negative to that job as well.
Right. But it was a great job. And great people. The people I worked with were incredible. People I met were incredible. Some of them, and we were servicing a group of people that were, again, really in distress, or people. Some of the stories that go
something
with
you
it,
can feel good about because you're actually making a difference in somebody's life.
Right. But what I got out of the point I was trying to make was that when we're in Vermont, I'm traveling Vermont at the time, I realized that there is a lot of empty space. You'd get a store here, you'd get roads, you get people. There's a lot of people living there. There's farmland. Here's the deal. While there is a federal property area in Vermont, a big, huge area of federal lands, which we're going to talk about at some point because I want to talk about gold panning, and that's going to be coming up later. You can get a permit. You can still, that was one of the first gold rushes in the East. It was in Vermont. So, going to the next step was traveling to these faraway northern areas of Vermont, you see all this land and you start looking and going, but it's not open and accessible to people. It is privately owned in large groups. Now, there is a lot of state land there, too, that you can access. I mean, especially on the Missisquoi River. You know, there's different locations that you can get to go. There's hiking trails. There's tons of that stuff. But it is not like in the Adirondack Park as well, for example, 50% of it is owned by private individuals. But still, it's over 6 million acres, and half of that is publicly owned property, which you have the right, as long as you follow the rules, to use. And you have to follow the rules. So yeah, and also that's why we're here, because we don't live, like my New York, if you've ever seen the pictures, my New York and their New York, you think New York City, we're nowhere near that.
About 300 miles away.
Yeah, and we are so far north. Here's another thing too and this is, people kind of are floored by this. I don't know what the rules are in your area, but we see things in this area because we're so close to the border that Homeland Security is doing everything. Like you can't, to my knowledge, you cannot get in and out of our area without being cataloged some way. Because we are there, and that's by Border Patrol, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's safety and security in my estimation. You know, you see drones that are flying along railroad tracks now, and you're going, okay, the world's changing. Then you're not going to just walk away anymore either. Now, if you get into a
I mean, back when we were kids, you didn't even really need a driver's license to cross the border. It's just like, go up, tell them who you are and where you live, and you keep going and go back and forth. I mean, I used to do it as soon as I could drive at 16. I went across the border without an adult. It wasn't a big deal. Now it's a huge deal.
And we understand why. I mean, this is part of the concerns that everyone has is, what are we going to do? What are you going to do with the changes that are coming? There's always trade-offs to everything. You can't just walk in and say one day, wow, this is going to be perfect. So we've talked about a lot of the good, right? And you want to move on to some of the bad? Like, what are some of the bad things going on?
Well,
like, what are some of the bad things going on?
Well, we in the world or here?
Well, and specifically,
because I don't really want to talk about the world right now.
Skills, right?
Oh,
I mean,
a lack of power. So the good things about being back to nature are also the bad things. Let me interrupt.
Living the dream. There is the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I want to move on to some of the bad of living the dream.
Well, we are closer to nature, and we have less power, which are also goods, but it's not a good one when nature is really rainy for 5 days in a row and everything you own is spotted with mud, and it's not really good when you want to build something and you have to turn the generator on to run your tools, which we've moved past that at this point, but for a long time...
We are on grid now, and I really want to point
that out. Yeah, we are on grid, but it was a 4-month process.
Right, and you know what, especially during COVID at the time when we couldn't do anything, we couldn't get anybody here, there wasn't a problem with it. I don't think it was just timing. I think there was a lot going on.
Well, there was a lot going on. You can't get right-of-ways from people if you can't go up and knock on their door and say hello, because, what if they're immunocompromised and you're in a pandemic and you're not even supposed to leave your house? How do you go get those signatures for right-of-way? So it was really a process that got delayed because of pandemic considerations, and the workers who would normally go do that for you were told to stay in their office or work from home. They were told not to go out in the field. So they were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. How do you move forward with your job, and how do you comply with the new mandates? It was very tricky.
And as part of this too, the situation that we have is a stepping stone toward the build that we're ultimately doing, which we have the materials on location. We get held up with things too. And do you want to just kind of give an indicator on what we're looking at going forward, or do you want to save that? It's okay with me either way.
Yeah, I mean, the eventual build will be a full barn as opposed to coops for the birds. The house is going to be an a partially earth-sheltered house with a living roof. It's going to be...
We already have a stamp on that.
Yeah,
That's
I mean,
already been
we've
approved.
got
We're under,
approved plans for that, and we've got our building permits and everything.
We've got everything in place.
It's a process, but if we want to do it deliberately and come out of this without huge debt, we're doing it slowly.
Right, which is taking a little longer than we had hoped. But I think really we were on a roll before. Like many other people, we were on a roll, really good roll, until we got hit with the COVID shutdown.
Yes, that was huge. And we've had some other setbacks and, personal life and homeschooling, things with pandemic. All of these things take a toll on your time. You don't begrudge them. You enjoy them. You make the most of them, but
some of the personal is more on the ugly, I think, at that point. But we'll get to that
where
later.
That's not something I want to get into right now.
What do you? But some of the bads.
Some of the bads. We are close to nature. It's a wonderful thing when the weather's good. It's not when the weather's bad.
Now, the other thing is, when we talked about utilities, one of the common utilities that you think about is your refrigeration and freezer system. I mean, that's huge,
Oh,
right?
yeah. When we were off-grid, we were spending so much money on ice. We could not get anything solar that could keep up with the 90-plus degree days we were having every day that summer.
Now, if we plan the system, and there are ways to do it. And again, now I'm going to turn to the sailing community. Mm-hmm. If you're going to buy a $10,000 system, I can keep you going. Now the question is that $10,000 system work in the Bahamas, or does it work up here?
And when you're under sail, it's totally different than when you're stationary in a field.
Right.
And do you want to spend that $10,000 on something that won't necessarily convert when you have the house? If you want an off-grid option as a backup, you may need different $10,000
on ice on an average.
We had a long span that was over 90 degrees, and it was like 3 bags of ice a day.
Right. Now the question you could ask is, did you really need to do that? Well, here's the thing: fresh foods, right, and dairy products. Could we have eliminated ice completely from the system? Because remember, you've also got other people, their kids involved here, and not just us.
Right. I don't think so, because a lot of it was your proteins.
Well, you go vegetarian.
We could have, but...
And canned goods. We didn't have any problem getting access to any of that, but...
No, we had plenty of food. It wasn't an issue of food. It was having to go to the store regularly and then having to do that during a pandemic
and still
as well.
Trying to maintain the same kind of menu that we really were operating in. Now, I'm going to speak to this real quickly with some of my sailing people. What you find mostly in the sailing community is 2 things that we didn't have available to us. Well, that's not entirely true. One, we did. If somebody runs into a problem with refrigeration, they go all vegetarian, canned, pressure cooked for the most part, and it's usually fairly bland. So what are you going to have in the morning? Well, you got your oatmeal. You're going to have, you may have eggs, which will last a reasonably long time without refrigeration. However, you're going to have, you're going to be opening a can of something, and you're going to have dried beans. You're going to have a vegetarian style lifestyle. But what they also get is the second part, which is they can fish. So they're getting fresh fish whenever available, and sometimes they're not because the fish aren't biting, or they don't have time, or the weather's wrong, but they can supplement.
We had fresh eggs.
That's right, we did have fresh eggs. Now, what do you do at that point? You got to change your entire lifestyle, and the problem is that some of the things
that's easier for adults, but not for children.
Yeah, that's the bottom line. Really, that's really what we're talking about. Could we have done it without a problem and eliminated ice?
We could have done it. I wouldn't say it would be without a problem.
Right. And what were we keeping in cold? I mean, we're today in milk for sure, right?
Fruit, vegetables, meats, and dairy.
And that's it. Cheese is included.
And some of your condiments you have to, you don't use them up. But what do you do? Right. Do you let them go bad? I mean, you don't want to buy a new bottle of anything, every time you have a meal.
Now, as a result of that, and you'll find this in Rockbottom Survival Skills, I looked at different ways. In fact, we solved a lot of problems during that time, which are in Rockbottom Survival Skills. But we'll move on for that. What else is the bad? I mean, is there anything else? What about paradigm shifting we always talk about,
Well, the beauty of being in a rural setting is that we get to walk away from each other in nature. However, when nature's not cooperating, or when it's dark or cold, you don't want to go outside, there is no privacy. We live in very close quarters, so if you want to have a private conversation, you really need to leave the building. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're not, while we did use every piece of camping gear and tents, we also had an RV. It was and the RV,
yes.
The trailer, the camper RV was what really gave us the status so that we could do things like get electricity, without that, we would not have been able to.
Right, because our yurt is technically a tent. Yeah. It's a very sturdy tent.
Now, every area is different.
Wonderful.
Some areas are okay with it. It's just you've got to look at the rules. So we were very, very, very concerned about following every necessary rule.
Yes, and the camper made it possible for us to have this. The camper has everything that you need to satisfy every regulation they come up with, because that's the way they're built.
Mm-hmm. And we followed the rules in the process. That's another story for another time of what's involved with that. But
right.
What about flipping a switch? That's the big. That seems to be our
flipping a switch
motto.
Is amazing. Yes, being able to flip a switch and have things happen. It's magic.
Water on demand, right? I mean,
that's a huge step.
Which we are now at the point. We've also replaced a lot of stuff. Water on demand. We've done this.
Yeah, we started out going to a spring because the well was being drilled a couple weeks after we got here. We had the well driller come in, and the talks had been in progress while we were moving here. So we knew that was going to be our first big thing to happen, is that we were going to have a well. But then if your well is 300 feet deep, you need a generator to pull the water up.
Yeah, that's the deal.
So it was a huge step going from, we're carrying jugs of water from the spring for our bathing. For our drinking, we were not going to a spring. We were actually we were purchasing water because we wanted to make sure that we didn't have any issues.
Yeah, we had a really cool system, though. It was an on-demand automated system where you put a dollar or a quarter in it.
Yeah, you put your quarters in and you get $5 worth, and you get 5 gallons of water.
Which is really cool. I mean, that's a big difference. And this was...
But still, we had to drive into town, which again, we're talking a 15-mile round trip, because it was really on our end of town, which was lucky. But 15 miles.
Yeah, and that system actually used municipal water, which was, again, filtered and UV treated. So the water coming out of there we knew was really, really good. And it worked under all situations. Right.
So then when the well was in, we needed the generator to draw the water.
This is a big problem people run into, is like, where are they going to get their water from? And you want to tell a story about Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah. So when I lived down in Pennsylvania, I had this wonderful woman I met her and her children at the library. She said, yeah, my husband and I were just so sick of the rat race in Philadelphia. We saw this piece of property. It had a barn and 10 acres, and we could afford it. And we thought, that's it. We're raising our kids in the country. And they got there, and they went to the neighbors, and they said, how do we turn the water on? And the neighbors looked at them and said, you don't. You drill a well. And they just didn't understand that, coming from a city that there is no switch. There is no municipal water. They bought a barn and 10 acres. And that's where they moved in with their 3 kids with no water. So coming from an urban situation, they had a lot to learn, and they loved it. I mean, she was a wonderful woman. They converted that barn into a house. They did it all themselves. They got their well.
And they got their freedom, right?
And they got their freedom. Yeah. They were raising their kids deliberately the way they wanted to, and I'm sure there were a lot of hardships and fights in that process.
And you don't have to be someone who's going to build a house or a place. I'll give you an example on one that I ran into when I was working with the programs where we're in the outdoors. you know, and I had other people that were working with me at the time, and we talked about it, and we'd be up on a mountain someplace, and a lot of times, and we did a lot of things, everything from canoeing, these really great places, to rivers, to, like, you know, even whitewater rafting, as I said. But one of the primary things in the Adirondacks is you've got 4,000 foot peaks, okay, and that's the 46ers. Well, we like to knock off or hit as many of those. You know, it's really a bad attitude. I'm going to knock off a peak, you know, because the problem is, are you really enjoying nature? Okay, I mean, this is why I kind of struggle with these words, but we do, and it's part of the experience, and it's part of the process for self-fulfillment, I guess, part of the process to realize you can do it, that you're out there. And we did this in the winter too. You know, there are times when I was on top of a peak and I was like, oh my gosh, you know, all right, I'm getting too old for this. However, we kept going, and overcoming those obstacles was probably one of the coolest part of my jobs. Now, getting back to the 4,000 foot peaks. So what happened was that another guy I was working with at the time, who was in the same guiding situation, or the experience that I was doing, working with the same population, said, you know, he says, I was up there one time on one of the peaks, and there was a family up there, and they didn't bring any water with them. Now, I have always told everybody, bring 2 quarts of water. That was our policy too, by the way. We also carried water pumps for filters so that we could get a ground surface water, which is, if we had to, we had iodine. So we were always prepared for that situation. But there are times when you're on a climb or you're doing something, there just isn't any water available. You got to go back down to get it. So what happened was that this family went up there, and the guy got to the top, and he said, well, where's the tap? Okay, where's the tap on top of the mountain? And my buddy was like, what? You know, what a problem. But I got to explain something. He wasn't wrong for one mountain only in the 46ers. And that one is the one you can drive to the top of.
Is that Whiteface?
Whiteface Mountain. There was a tap.
You only have to walk the last 100 yards of that one.
That's right. And I think they've taken that out since the last time I've been up there, honestly. It used to be a potable water source, and people could get water there. And I'm thinking, if this guy went to the top, but my friend didn't really, I don't think he really made that connection. So somebody coming from out of town, not really understanding it, thinking, wow, they all have water. You know, this is, well, no, you get back into some of the trailless peaks, you get back in the middle of nowhere, there ain't nothing, man. you got to get some water.
And even people from this urban setting don't really know how to carry water up a mountain hike. I've done this with the school programs, and
not all urban. Like, we should not be.
Yeah, this is not a bash on urban. There are a lot of urban people who really know what they're talking about.
In the Adirondacks specifically, most of the actual founders are urban who came here, right, and really started the hiking programs and everything else. So they're well enculturated into what.
Yeah, I mean, I went hiking as a parent. Chaperone on a trip at school. And not only did most of the kids bring a soda for hydration, the teachers sponsoring running the trip also had soda. And I, of course, because I had been, with my kids on many such hikes, and I'm a camper, I had a backpack with apples and extra waters, and I had my water bottle, and I had nuts, and I had just the stuff that I normally take. And I'm looking at these kids and I'm thinking, wow. And I ended up giving away all of the water that I felt comfortable giving away, because I could gauge how much my child and I would normally drink. And I had extra because that's what I do. Well, and
that's the thing that the guy had done too, is up on the mountain, he'd given away, he was going to make sure the kids got water. You know what I mean? But it's dude, you're out, man.
I mean, for me to throw like 4 extra bottles of water in, plus our big bottles that we refill, because that's what I normally do, I only had 4 to give away, and it was a whole class.
Sure. Well, and you just shake your head. It's like, and I'm thinking, well, have you had 2 quarts? Would you have been okay? Now, look, out in the desert, and the answer, by the way, would have been yes. Out in the desert, you may need a gallon.
Yeah.
Read one of the best books I could ever tell you on backpacking is Colin Fletcher. And The Man Who Walked Through Time is one of my favorite books. And he talks about his water use. Now, this guy was an ex-Royal Marine, all right, during World War II. Not ex, but, he was a veteran. He was a Royal Marine veteran. So, I'm telling you, you just make sure that you cover the basic needs.
Yeah, and on water usage, I want to say that the female half of the household was quite adamant in living deliberately, moving here. We weren't giving up hot showers. We got quicker, and we didn't get them quite in the timely manner that we wanted. We got them daily, but it wasn't. But we did get them.
Yeah, and I went through
it was a big deal.
At least 3 different water systems to get it down right. And the first day when I didn't have it ready, I felt awful because I said, "Oh, I'm going to deliver this," and it was like
11 o'clock at night before anybody's getting showered.
Showers,
but it happened. We got it done, and.
But then the pressure wasn't
enough.
enough.
And like I said, the female half of the household at the time was long-haired. And there was not enough pressure to get soap out of long hair, so it was kind of a greasy week. But
yeah, but I
fixed that.
It got solved.
Within a week, that got fixed.
So we have plenty of water, 30 psi at least.
It was clean. It was just still soapy.
Yeah. This is how I learned. This is how you learn. You learn through it. And I'm thinking, wow, it doesn't bother me. I think I was
short hair. You don't need a lot of pressure to get that soap out of short hair, but when you have long hair, it can be an issue.
So you got to think of those things as well. So, yeah, there's another one of the bad. Now, what about changing your paradigm? Now, is that really a bad or a good? I mean, first of all, what is a paradigm, and what does it change?
The paradigm was.
Okay, well, let's define a paradigm, right? It's a set of constructs that you have in your mind that are rules of operation.
Like living in a house that's square with walls and a roof, and having switches that turn lights on, and
well, the paradigm
indoor plumbing that comes on with just a little tiny pressure on a knob.
Okay, but a paradigm might also be. It's not exactly where I was going, but okay, I get it. A paradigm for someone might be that all my life I have known that I have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock to take care of animals. I no longer am. I'm retired. I make enough money now. I don't have to. I've decided not to do that. And you've got to shift mentally as well as the physical action that I don't need to get up at 4 a.m. anymore. Maybe I can now sleep until 10. Now that's a simple one. But it could go reverse. I always got up at 8 o'clock in the morning to go to work, and now
I get up at 5 o'clock with the
5 o'clock
birds.
with the birds.
Or with that stupid rooster who starts crowing about an hour before daylight.
So that's a paradigm shift. That's an internal shift that you're going to have to make. Now, what's the advantage and disadvantage to paradigm shifting?
Well, it shakes you up. It gives you new ideas. It makes you appreciate old ones, or it makes you wonder why you ever bought into old ones.
Or it also means you need to change them to be able to be successful. And that's the one I probably focus in on the most. So in other words, if I got to be at work at 8 o'clock every morning and...
Say that again.
Okay.
If I got to be.
If I got to be at work at 8 o'clock every morning, and now I have to go the extra distance to get up at 5 a.m. to make sure that the chores are done instead, that's a paradigm shift because, and the paradigm is, in my head, it's not worth it, right? So that's where the negative is coming in the paradigm, right? And you've got to switch that. The paradigm thought is, I'm not getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go do that. And I don't know if I'm being clear enough on this, am I? In other words, you've got to come up with an idea that this is okay now. That's really the shift. The shift means, yeah, I should get up at 5. I need to get up at 5. I don't have a choice. I'm accepting it and I'm embracing it. That's different than, oh my gosh, I got to do this and I hate it. Because if you have that hatred for that, you're never going to shift your paradigm. You're going to say, well, I can't make that work because I don't see a reason.
Okay, I have girlfriends that I've told about our lifestyle, and I have really only one that's truly been here to experience it, but I've told other people about this lifestyle. Actually, 2 people have been here and have experienced it. John's also had others come here, other friends. They look at me and they're like, wow, I don't know how your kids are doing this because mine would say no. What were they coming from? What is the background? We have very different expectations. We have different priorities. And really, it's a matter of prioritization. We're not giving up the things that we think are important. We're embracing the things that we think are important. And we're letting go of the things that are not as important so that we can move forward in a way that is beneficial to everybody.
The other, and the other point of this is like they wouldn't do it. It's just because of the convenience factor. But as far as work per work of time, I don't think that it's probably easier. Would you say? They would say that. They have said
yes,
that.
I also want to point out that prior to moving here, I used to ration their internet gaming time.
Right.
So they were already used to minimal internet gaming, and then they went to really very little,
really
if any, internet gaming. So this was a priority in my life, was you're not going to be on the computer all the time. And it wasn't even possible when they came here because we didn't have the electricity for it. Solar power only went so far.
We're not paying the extra for your phones to get even more gaming time.
Right. The hotspot had enough to get you through school, but it really... we weren't taking the chance of running out of hotspot and having to pay more for their schooling
because school was online.
Because school was a priority for us. Gaming was not. So we pulled out. We bought a net and we played badminton. We did things outside to engage everybody in a. One of the
things we did was put a pool up.
We had a pool.
And that was really a big deal, especially if you want to talk about cooling. If it was 90 degrees for almost a month, probably off and on at the time. Well, this is an outdoor setting, too. It's not like you're not going into refrigeration. I mean, air conditioning, right? Which is refrigeration, but
yes.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think it was pretty successful overall. I mean, we've had conversations. I don't believe we have that the kind of negativity other than an appreciation for when they're looking at stuff, they're going to say we're not going to do that. They know when they're going to walk into it, they're going to say, yeah, we've done that. Who cares?
Yeah, the kids have a very different attitude than most who have never experienced this.
I think the fundamental question was always, do you feel safe here? And absolutely, without a doubt, the answer was yes.
They were very happy with the overall experience. I don't know if they were happy with every day and every moment. Nobody is. None of us were, I don't think. We've all had our moments of...
Right, but when the plug's pulled, which means... And really what we're talking really is like, again, we get back to gaming or...
We did not take away phones. They still had their phones, but they were in charge of making sure that they were solar powered and charged. And everybody had a little solar charger for their phone. And, if it was rainy, they had to ration themselves.
And they had to go back and get it because it was outside, so it didn't get wet and destroyed. The other thing, too, is the car became used as a charger a lot. That was kind of funny. That always cracked me up. So, yeah, from time to time, the car became the charger, and that was kind of interesting. But, that doesn't exist right now, so let's be really clear.
Yes, we have, that was a 4-month period. It was in the summer.
Right.
So basically, we camped for 4 months.
Yeah. And we had but we went other places. We did things. It's not like it was all,
within the realm of a pandemic. So we went to state parks. We did what we could do. We went out on the boat. We couldn't do a lot of things were closed. Gyms were closed. A lot of restaurants were closed. Very few. They had like drive-thrus only. But to the extent that we could get out within what was available to us at the time, we did.
Well, here's an important point, too, and I think I want to go back on something you said there with the boat, for example, right? There's a difference between what, everybody says, well, you have your toys. You have, in this case, we're talking about like a 20-foot deck boat, and as well as I have a sailboat, which the sailboat doesn't get used. I also have a rowboat, and we have a few canoes. You have to have the vehicle to make sure that you can tow all that. I ran into a problem off and on with a truck, and then some of that just sat there. because we had other priorities. At one point, I had a front wheel bearing problem with my truck. I had to go in and repair it. Now, that is its whole nother situation. That's the ugly, okay? I mean, really, if we're going to move on to the ugly, would you say that...
That was the ugly because it was not supposed to be that complicated. But once you get it down into pieces, then you can't very well take it to a mechanic because it's in pieces.
Well, anybody who's... Right. Well, first of all, I'm not going to. I wasn't going to. I could fix it. I'd never run into the experience where I couldn't separate something. And the problem is, and then after a lot of review and talking to people, and some of the people that told me, okay, I did everything, other than I didn't have certain power hammer tools that were available to a mechanic on a lift because I had to jack it up. But I have a jackhammer. I tried everything. And since it's been done, so what did I end up doing finally? Well, finally I cut off the studs to the front knuckle, and that bearing was shot. And the housing that it was attached to is the front knuckle. You're supposed to be able to take out a few bolts and then just pull the whole thing apart. Now, it's got corrosion in there.
By the way, it's amazing to have a man who knows how to do this. or a woman, but, for me, it's a man.
So, couldn't get the ball joints out. Okay, I tried. I had all kinds of tools, and at that point too, it's not even just taking it. First of all, I would have, you're talking about. I would have had to jack it around, put it kind of back together, and then get it towed to a mechanic. At that point, I was like not going to give up until I did it. Okay, I had something to prove. I'm not afraid to say that. And ultimately, I struck on, wow, I could cut the ball joints, which I did because I have some tools for that. More tools. So you got to have tools. I've told people that a lot. You got to have the tools.
Yeah, moving here without the tools and without all the camping and survival gear that John had would have been impossible. I will say that most of the camping and survival gear came from him, but a fair amount of the tools were mine. We kind of came jointly with tools.
And going back on this, can it be done without it? Absolutely. However, if you're going to bring in children in a situation, I can make their lives great. And if we didn't, you're going to have to look at a different way of doing things. Mm-hmm. Also, what we would do jointly as just two people is a lot different. Could I have built a log cabin with what we have here? Yeah, we've got tons of wood. I could have done any of those things. But that's not what we chose to do because that is not the overall plan. Why? Because a log cabin's going to need to be heated, and what we're working toward...
Right, and then you get into zoning things, and we're only allowed one house here, so it's going to be the house that we want.
Yeah, you don't get a choice. See, now that's a real problem. I said, when we kept getting back to it, well, then we're stuck with the zoning. We're either going to have to tear it down. So let's just, push forward and use what we can and do it in the way we're supposed to. And we did, and we've been doing it, and it's been a pain.
And a yurt, which is technically a tent, was really our only zoning option.
Right. Well, we also have the camper, so don't forget. Without
right, but
that...
it's temporary. We are not allowed to have it. We're only allowed one permanent house.
Right. But the camper also supplies all the other needs and the process of doing that. By the way, if you're going to do something and you got to look at it, I'm going to give you one quick tip. Get a list of people like porta potty companies in the area that do the deliveries and takeaways and everything, because that's going to be a huge portion. So water and then taking care of waste removal. The other part of this is that you got to ask the question, how much are you willing to sacrifice, right? Like for every gain, there's going to be a sacrifice. If it isn't one person or two people, it's probably going to be a lot easier. But it doesn't mean it's impossible with more. So, on the ugly side, again, we had this truck that I was bound and determined to fix, so I ended up cutting all off the ball joints, but I had to have a ball joint kit to put it back together. Now I could have gone someplace and rented one. There's a lot of things I could have done, but I'm like, nah, I'm just going to buy it, then we can do it, because we may have to do this on 3 or 4 other sides, 2 other sides. All right, so more of the ugly. What are the other things that are the ugly? And some of this is self-sufficiency, but doesn't it go to one other thing, which is time?
Time and storage.
Right. That's been a big issue. combining two households in storage. What do you do with that?
Right, because we've been together for about 5 years now, and this has been a gradual process of reducing the two households. When we first combined households, there was a huge yard sale that lasted way too long, and way too much just ended up going in the dump because we had to reduce. And
some of it really needed to go to the dump, I think.
Yes,
it had been, it's an anchor.
Every time,
right?
It is an anchor. And
it's like the George Carlton joke. I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but you're packing stuff up all the time, right? I mean, think about moving.
And I have things that haven't been unpacked since then. I mean, they're still in the same box I put them in when we moved in together.
So, would you say selective downsizing? And that would be ugly for
selectively downsizing on a regular basis ever since, and we still are. And you know what? At the end of the day,
like, wow, I wish I hadn't gotten rid of that. And then you'll think about it and say, but I didn't use it in like 8 years.
Or you could say, wow, I'm glad the bad mojo that went with that was gone, but it would have been helpful. Let's just get a new one that comes with no mojo.
Yeah, that's kind of a big deal, I think overall.
Also, it helps us create ours, because you have his, you have hers, and then we have ours. And if you're going to have a life together, you really need to have more of ours than you do of his and hers.
And I'm going to put a relationship plug in here. One of the things we both came to it was we actually planned our life initially about what are the deal breakers, what works, what doesn't. We call it the whiteboard, which I get thrown in my face all the time.
Yeah.
Rightly so. What does that mean, I get it thrown in my face? Well, it was on the whiteboard, so it's non-negotiable. In other words, I need this.
We talked about that one from the beginning. Yeah. It's something that's needed for sanity and happiness.
But everything's open. But the number one thing is every single day waking up and saying, I'm committed. I'm committed to my wife. I'm committed to what we're doing.
Yes, we are committed.
Yeah. Doesn't even sound right, does it? Yeah, commitment's number one. I can't tell you about my past as far as whether I've been good at that or not. It doesn't matter. It starts with the decision to live deliberately. Absolutely. And I think we have maintained that.
And a lot of the things that we hold on to from our past are really negative, and we're holding on to them more out of habit or more out of what we feel is a misplaced obligation. You don't have to hold on to all of the negativity.
Well,
you should hold on to the positivity.
Too, right? I mean, we're shifting paradigms. In other words, I'm always used to dealing with this, so break that paradigm. How do you do it? Break the habit. It's easy to say, but and I'm not saying I'm not still working on a lot of it too.
And when you do, you end up living the dream, but some of that dream has drudgery mixed in, so you can't just say, oh, it's all unicorns and rainbows now. It's a dream, but it's still got enough reality to really keep you centered and grounded.
Okay, well, what about some of the outside, outside ugly or rain, snow, privacy we talked about? Did we talk about the rain and the snow? I mean, we alluded to the mud and...
Yes, when it's raining for multiple days, everything is muddy. No matter what, the floors are impossible to keep clean, and then you just have to do your best, and when it stops raining, you do some more.
But, and also you think about your design features, because what we're learning is we definitely need a mudroom, right? Now, we don't have a mudroom here. However, I could say, now here's a problem in a yurt for anybody who's not. The geometry of a yurt is excellent for high winds. We've had, 70-mile-an-hour winds probably?
60s, something. Yeah,
I
think
would say we've
60s.
Gusted higher, but okay. I'll defer to 60-mile-an-hour wind speeds. But the shape of the building is such, the shape of the structure is such that the wind really does go around it. You start adding other features to it, you change that aerodynamic structure of the wind. You change it completely. So you can't do it. The other thing, too, is we had neighbors who were like, when it snows, that whole thing's going to collapse. And one guy said, you don't know what they built. You have no idea. Well, guess what? In the middle of the winter, we were like one of the only places and structures around who had 0 snow on our roof.
Yeah, it was really awesome. It would sound like an avalanche when you're inside and you're laying in bed and you can hear the snow cascading down your roof. It was really amazing and scary at first because we hadn't experienced that before, but it really does slide right off. I don't think we ever had more than 2 inches of snow.
No.
Then that quickly slid off every time.
Right. Also, I made some modifications. I made a couple of modifications which help, I think, in the process. What else are we looking at? Privacy we talked about. That's always a big issue. Outside world presentation, right? Like how we appear to the outside world?
Yeah, this is a real issue with, do you really want people coming over to see your yurt? And are people going to be able to handle this kind of a lifestyle? And I've seen this on other people with yurt living. They have the same issues. It's just,
well, tiny
it's
houses have
alternative.
the same problem too.
Yeah,
We've
I mean,
got
where
a-
do you
we-
go? Where are you
let's-
bringing people into?
And let's be clear, we have a tiny house. Now, I'm not sure where that ended up overall, but we had somebody living in a tiny house not very far from us. Mm-hmm. So you're starting to see a lot of this movement move up more and more, the tiny structure movement. The problem is that, we've had visitations from government officials who are doing like taxes and...
Yeah, the assessor's been
he's
by,
been
he's
here,
looked
and
at it,
he
he's scratched his head, and
and then we had a conversation about other properties in the area, and one is like, well, if you don't move something, then we're going to tax it. And I'm thinking, well, what's the amount? And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Well,
we can handle that.
But this person that he was talking about, I'm talking bag here, right? I got to, you don't know, right? But the tiny house was, the guy had very little property. I mean, they were like a quarter acre maybe.
and
or
a very
a
small
lot.
pad that he had parked
Right.
the tiny
So-
house on. And he said, well, yeah, he's going to be really hard pressed to move that because you got to move it every 6 months
Right.
for it to not be taxable. Then you show that it's temporary and movable.
So we have, in our area, we're looking at several acres. And to give a kind of throw out, now there's also acreage I put under management or that we control. They are not contiguous. In other words, they're not attached to this property. And it's fairly a fairly good amount of property that we could actually move things around. And some of that property is large but not usable as well. Boy, am I vague enough here?
You're vague enough,
Okay.
but the camper that we have moved several times, and some of that is just
We've got
because
plenty of room to move
it was time
We
to
have a
move
lot
it.
of
We needed that
property to do
space for
that.
something else, and some of it's
Well-
like, oh, we're closing in on 6 months. Let's
Well,
move it.
I think we can say initially, 5 acres in Independence minimum. That's for your homestead, for your area that you're working on. And why is it a homestead, too? That's the other question. In New York State, your primary residence is called a homestead. It's part of that. And that's not legal advice. That's just a definition that I've found from my experience. If you take any advice from me, then you're probably an idiot. But sorry.
And the homesteading movement, to me, what that means, which is not legal, it's just what it means in my mind is you're trying for self-sufficiency. You're trying for food self-sufficiency is a huge one. We are not, at this point in time, trying for energy self-sufficiency. When the house is done, maybe we will have a solar backup, maybe not, but right now we are totally on grid.
Yeah, and I don't see any
But it's
reason
more of a
not to
food
be.
self-sufficiency issue and a building your own.
Well, most of the people that are on homesteads, for the you don't see a lot of them that are off grid. That's really a separate entity, right? You can be off grid, you can be homestead off grid, you can be permaculture off grid. We're going to be more. I think a lot of what we're shooting for is more permaculture. Do we have electricity? Yes, we will.
For as long as we can.
For as long as we can. And that is the point. I want to throw a switch, right?
I would love to be able to still have every system function if the grid were to go down, because it does occasionally go down. But I really want the grid there.
Well, the other thing is, take Pennsylvania where my grandfather lived. I would go to his place during the summers, which was near Bald Eagle State Park. I can just say that. Nobody lives there anymore. It's been sold, that I'm related to. So the bottom line is that this particular place had a spring-fed system. Mm-hmm. So all the water, the pressure in the house was all spring-fed. Now, I'm sure he had an accumulator tank. I never got into that part with him, but there was no, to my knowledge, pump per se. It came down from a cistern that was on the side of a hill. And
by the way, that's fairly typical in the Endless Mountains. Pennsylvania's
sure.
got a lot of spring-fed, gravity-fed systems where when the electricity goes out, they still have water.
And he had a very large pond on it that had been that he had put in. I'm trying to remember. Was it an acre? Maybe an acre pond. I thought that was pretty decent size.
That's nice.
It's pretty big. It may be less. I mean, don't quote me. I'm going back a lot of years here. Had bluegill. It had cattails on the side. I mean, there was a lot of stuff there. Plus, he had garden setups, and he had a lot of other what we think of now for organic gardening, and not just for his own research and for his writing, but that's the way they like to live. It was an old farmhouse that had been converted, and he did all the work on it. He was a carpenter. What I'm getting at here is, what does that mean, the homesteading lifestyle? I think that what we need to really be aware of is this is the, quote, modern homesteading movement. It is not the one that took place on the move toward the west. That was open land areas that people went into to be settled so that they could expand the United States. Some of that does still exist, but it's few and far between, and it's getting harder to find. So right now you're going to have to look at developing something where you're looking at the kind of self-sufficiency that you can get.
And zoning is a huge problem.
Huge problem. Well, for us it's not really, but
it's not a problem, but you really have to watch yourself and watch what you do to stay compliant, because a worst case scenario, they can make you undo everything you've worked hard to do,
and
because it doesn't comply, and they can fine you in the process. So you could end up tens of thousands of dollars in debt with nothing.
And again, this isn't legal advice. It's not professional advice. Go seek somebody like a competent attorney. Go talk to your people.
Yeah, and the zoning people
really
that we have encountered have been really friendly
people.
And open, and they don't want to deal with the mess and the fallout from you not following rules either. So they have been very helpful to tell us how to comply.
Well, we've also
and what we
cautious.
Can't do. So we just don't push the rules.
Yeah, that's pretty much. But there's no reason
you can take them to the edge, but don't push over.
Well, taking to the edge, the question is, what is compliancy? If you're staying compliant, you're fine. What does that look like? But sometimes you got to do your own research. I mean, you can't
rely entirely on them. So we're going to wrap it up for this episode, and we'll see you again on Rockbottom Survival Skills.
I'm John Elden Gibbons, and yes, I will see you again on Rockbottom Survival Skills with my lovely and intelligent, highly effective wife,
Teresa S. Landry.
Highly effective? Really? I said that?
It is what it is. My amazing husband.
So for right now, that's all the time we have today for this podcast, but join us for the next podcast, and we're going to continue this conversation. I'm John Elden Gibbons with Teresa S. Landry. Thanks for tuning in. We are so grateful for you joining us today, and we have to say thanks for your continued support. It's time to ask yourself, what am I waiting for? Because it's time to live deliberately. Your journey can start now. This has been a Gibbons Media production, all rights reserved, 2021 John Gibbons Media.